Just a quick note, the Intelligent Speech Conference is back for its 4th year. This year, the theme is crossings. It's Saturday, June 25th, and is a one-day, intense online extravaganza that focuses on independent educational podcasts, a veritable three-ring circus of edutainment from your own comfy chair. Tickets are available at intelligentspeechconference.com. Tickets are $30, but $20 if you pick up early bird tickets before June 1st. And if you use my promo code FOOD, that's an extra 10% off for you. All the info will be in the description box as well. I hope to see you there. Episode 44, Iron, Bricks, and the Invention of Toast. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. Once again, though talking about food, I find myself at a political and economic crossroads. Iron and industry are inseparable from American food because they are big reasons that the American colonies grew into what they became and why they broke away. So by the 18th century, politics and industry definitely influenced what and how people ate, including toast. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the modern slices of bread that we use for sandwiches and the like are not as old as we think they are. This is one of those realizations I came to accidentally while looking under rocks for something else entirely. Yes, people cut pieces of bread, and it wasn't all torn hunks, and the sippet, a piece of dipping bread for sopping up reheated whatever at that last meal of the day that came to be called supper in its honor, was sometimes a slice in the 17th century. But the approximately rectangular prism that we conjure in our heads when we think slice of bread was an almost unknown thing before the 18th century or even the 19th century in the North American colonies or anywhere else in the world. Figuring out how all this connected lit up this one obscure corner of my brain from 2011, the Toaster Project, which I will link in the show notes. It explores both how simple and complex making toast is in the age of electricity. In our time, toast making is the simplest of things. Michelle Obama lists it as a simple task she missed and relishes with her return to private life. Poking at these ideas is when I realized my stubborn connection of iron and bricks and toast may be entirely due to a line from Douglas Adams' 1992 book, Mostly Harmless, where the production of toast is seen as both the most basic thing imaginable and yet only possible when so much other technology has already been figured out and is at your fingertips. And that brought me face to face with the fact that toast, as 21st century people think about it, was made possible in the 18th century, which likely has you, listener out there, asking me if I'm sure or maybe I'm crazy. But most of all, how does one link toast and iron? To get there, I need to take you a few steps back. The relationship of people and wealth was undergoing radical changes in the 18th century. The baby steps of the Industrial Revolution were underway in England and some other parts of Western Europe. Strangely enough, the easiest way to see this is to look at the ways the hows and whys of war in Europe were changing at this time. In England, the raising of sheep for the army's growing need for uniform jacket wool and beef cows to answer the Admiralty's call for salt beef was increasing. Landlords were using the Enclosures Act to boot a big chunk of the hereditary peasantry off their farmland. As a result, the cities were filling up with masterless men, that is, people hunting for employment that was outside the old guild, workshop, and peasant structure. At the same time, traditional workshop manufacturing was starting to be replaced with larger factories. The increase in the size of ironworks was typical of this increase of size and sophistication of manufacturing at this time. blast furnaces, bloomeries, and then fineries were changing from these little village piles to large chimney stacks and watermills financed by partnerships. With the increases in imports of iron as well as sugar and spice and so on, the financing for making these trade networks work had to be figured out. Credit and payment were no longer restricted to just royalty and the nobility with family connections scattered across the continent, who also had large chunks of transportable wealth like gold jewelry, silver dishes, and the like. Common persons were getting into the financing game. Incidentally, we can partly blame the Spanish for this. Their lunatic imports of silver and gold into Europe from South America had added so much coining metal to the market, even commoners had regular access to coin. And this meant how people could be wealthy was also changing. In post-Western Roman Empire Europe, the only way to be really rich was to have land populated by people that made you stuff. They grew you pigs and eggs and wheat, maybe mined some lead and produced bales of wool. You skimmed the labor of your peasants and bought gold-embossed luggage and shiny robes, something like that. But there was absolutely no way to be really rich without a big old pile of land full of peasants working it. Until, that is, cash became easier to get. So more people could buy stuff using money. The tippy top of the ruling class were always buying stuff, but they just as often did it by exchanging jewelry, silver goblets, bolts of fabric, or fancy salt holders. This was not a practical way to fund the global trading networks that were developing over the 17th and 18th century. And as a result, wealth started to be about piles of cash rather than just about piles of land. Also, there were now more workers that were paid in money wages, rather than in haunches of beef, permission to cut new roof thatching, ells of cloth, barrels of beer, and cheeses. Now, I'm oversimplifying and skipping over lots, but what it came down to is for the first time in Britain, one could become wealthy and be wealthy without owning a giant swath of land on one of the home islands. The thing that made you rich could actually be located far away. Wealth became more movable, partly out of the necessity of funding global trade networks for things like Swedish iron, Caribbean sugar, Atlantic cod, and spices from the East Indies, not to mention captive humans from West Africa, India, and the Americas. And partly because there was just more coin, and there were starting to be more things kind of regular people could buy. This idea that wealth was more transportable, growable, and divisible led to the kind of thinking that blossomed out into Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. Before the 17th century, one of the main reasons for going to war was to move a border so somebody else's property could now be yours, and then you could use it to mine for lead or raise sheep on it or whatever. But with Spain transporting chunks of a mountain made of silver across the sea, or the Dutch moving cloves from the mysterious East, or the English hauling cargoes of ivory, silk, or people, wealth was no longer so much about places, but things. So the ways of getting rich started to resemble our modern methods, getting more people to bring more of their wealth to you for things you were making, as well as investing money so it made more money. These were almost unheard of ideas in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yes, I know they weren't totally new, but it was newly available to a much wider audience, and the influx of coined money made it more possible for more people to participate. It was in this atmosphere that Mr. Smith took this idea of mobile wealth and started thinking about ideas that we now know as return on investment and optimization. Up until now, peasants had essentially been tools, but they had been connected to the land. And a good landlord knew that caring for the peasants and dedicating a certain amount of time to their welfare was an important part of the landlording game. With this new idea of wealth that was separable from the land, landlords started to see the people who worked the land as separate from it as well. This way of seeing things would change slowly for the next few centuries. Some things definitely made people's lives better, but the disconnecting of people and land to the point where it seems to have been forgotten that the health of one profoundly affects the health of the other is also now having negative effects on people's lives and on the land. By the early 18th century, this peeling apart of the ancient connection of people and land in England meant that innovations could start to happen. Several recent additions to the European landscape sped those innovations along. One was the introduction of caffeine. It improves memory and energy, so late-night philosophical discussions among the movers and shakers of the day were remembered and less likely to devolve into sloppy, drunken brawls or just snooze fests. Another was the printing press, which meant ideas like the results of metallurgical tinkering, mill designs, and iron cladding for plows were spreading about more easily. More efficient cultivation of food crops started to happen. The increase in salt and sugar production from the Caribbean also meant more food could be preserved, so there was less waste to spoilage. The importation of more food meant fewer British residents were needed for food production at home, so they could be employed making stuff out of metal, stuff out of cloth, and stuff out of wood. Because food was being shipped in from Ireland, from the Caribbean, and from the North American colonies, more people were able to be soldiers and sailors to defend and expand the empire, and to ship in the food and raw materials that lay the groundwork for the earliest moments of the British Industrial Revolution. Up until recently, for the most part, food was just a thing people grew and made to stay alive or as a job. Until sugar and coffee and tea and beef and tobacco and the colonies, food, or at least consumable stuff, had never been a way to get insanely rich. But the fact that these were things that lasted and could be moved very far away from where they were made changed the way people thought about food, and then about the people who worked to make the food. Where there was once a reasonably limited supply of people to make the food, and it only traveled so far before being consumed, and could only last a limited time before going bad, meant that, yes, there was money in things like flour and beer and pickled fish, but not tons. It was distributed amongst the rich and poor alike. And if you treated the food growers too poorly, well, there would be no food. So a line on peasant survival had to be held. But now, real money was being made from the iron shipped in from the colonies. It was fined and smithed and then sold as hoes and shovels and machetes and boiling cauldrons to sugar plantations, or as axes and saws and fire dogs and nails to the colonies. The people doing this work had money to purchase sugar and wheat and dried cod that was being made with the tools they were selling. And so for the first time, really, fortunes were being made in Britain by people who didn't own piles of land. And it was the problem of the people you were paying to grow food that had to sort out the issue of how to treat the people growing the food that you were buying. Way, way over there. Now back in our neck of the woods, the North American colonies, cash cropping, growing raw materials for shipping back to the home island, was the name of the game in the 18th century. In the northern colonies, this meant beans, beef, and cod, and cranberries. In the mid-Atlantic colonies, this meant more beef and lots of wheat. In the southern colonies, it was tobacco, rice, and beef. Each region also contributed tons and tons of wood pitch, tar, turpentine, charcoal, and the mass timbers, beams, planks, and iron for the exploding shipping industry, both military and commercial. This exchange of materials, raw and finished, meant everyone in the North American colonies were also getting more farm tools and more hearth tools, more hoes, axes, shovels, spiders, spoons, and knives, and forks. All that meat on iron spits meant having forks around the hearth to move things around was handy. Now, along with the metal tools for the hearth was changing as well. In the 17th century, lots of the hearths were stone, made from the rocks dug up while building that first house and clearing that first field. Chimneys were often at least partly wattle and daub, that kind that was rigged to fall away from the house when they inevitably caught fire. But here in the 18th century, another byproduct of all the tree cutting and charcoal burning and iron blooming was bricks. Stone was handy material for many of the early furnaces and mills, but it took lots of work to cut and haul and shape. Brick, on the other hand, was a standardish shape and was easy to plan and build with. The unlimited North American wood meant that firing bricks wasn't a big deal, and the stream beds of the East Coast had plenty of clay that made great bricks. If you've ever gotten dirty in the state of Georgia, you'll know that it feels like half the state at least is covered in the red clay used for making bricks. Too much rain and that red clay gets all over you. And when it dries, there's brick dust all around. And that clay wasn't just handy for making bricks. A lively pottery business appeared in the colonies as well. Fine porcelain, or what we generally think of when we say china when talking about dishes, was still a product of the Old World. Imported from both the Far East and the emerging potteries of Holland and England, this was the fancy stuff used by the rich as a display of power and by the middling sort for special occasions. But redware, earthenware, stoneware, glazed and unglazed, were used in cooking and storage. They made for much better containers for food preservation than the wood containers and bark wrappers that were more common in the 17th century. Making and firing bricks often went hand in hand with the making of kitchen vessels. For once they started to be made, there were never enough bricks in the colonies. Along with their use in building structures for the manufacture of iron and pottery, bricks quickly became important as building material in the new cities in the North American colonies. The Great London Fire of 1660 was still pretty fresh in lots of people's minds. To support the trade of raw materials heading to England and manufactured items coming back to the early port cities like Boston, Massachusetts, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Newport, Rhode Island, Baltimore, Maryland, Norfolk, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, Wilmington, North Carolina, and Charleston, South Carolina, they all pushed for brick construction as soon as buildings started to get somewhat dense. Putting down bricks in the streets was also a priority so the wagon loads of goods wouldn't get bogged down in the mud, even in the rainy seasons. The increased manufacture of bricks for these purposes also meant they were a favored material for domestic construction in the growing cities as well. And having bricks to build hearths meant it was easy to try these new fangled hearth designs. Ones that sent more heat into the house and less up the chimney. One feature of the new hearths is that they were smaller. It turned out having a huge open fireplace wasn't such a great idea for most people. These easier to build with bricks hearths also meant more little fireplaces could be built to individually warm rooms, along with those nifty fireback stoves. Another result of the shrinking fireplace and easier to manage bricks was that the bread oven could also be brought inside. So baking wasn't an all-day affair removed from the house. Baking might even happen twice a week instead of once. And in the very largest and densest of cities like Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, there were even bakeries where people could go buy their daily bread. Especially in these larger cities, people with the sort of jobs that made money rather than raw materials were starting to purchase more food instead of simply growing and processing and trading for everything they consumed. And more food was somewhat more shelf-stable. Dried beef, stoneware pots of potted jams and preserves, butter, cheese, and salted fish. And then there were the luxuries: tea, coffee, chocolate, and tobacco. Unlike at the end of the 17th century when fast foods were few and far between and were, mainly just heated up bits of old meals, the 18th century suddenly had the enticing possibility of combining this shelf-stable food with that one. Instead of the knife-edge existence almost everyone had for most of the 17th century, where just about everyone had to work all the time or die of exposure and starvation, people beyond the very most wealthy started to have time to sit and talk. These 2-room houses, and sometimes 3 or 4, started to become places for community and entertaining, not just collapsed exhaustion. And fireplaces were changing into something cozy for gathering around. No longer were they only for cooking. So you have people sipping cider or tea or beer with some cheese and butter and bread and maybe even some jam at hand. Bread is now being made by housekeepers with a cook or a scullery to help, or even bought at one of those bakeries. With knives more available, slices can be cut from these more expertly made loaves instead of hunks simply torn off. And with the new hearth forks, products of the increased metals trade, these slices of bread can be warmed or even gently browned, that is, toasted, over these cozy fires, and even spread with butter or jam. Yeasted muffins and small cakes might also receive the same treatment. This was such a novel experience. Toasting bread or a muffin over a fire and spreading it with butter or jam and eating it with a convivial beverage was such a wondrous and delicious experience that people wrote of it in their journals or letters to a friend when recommending an inn or a tavern along the road or making notes of their travels. I had bread that had been toasted, and it was a wondrous new taste. This is one of those things I never expected to find. The invention of toast is not a thing I had ever considered tracking down or even pondered that it had a findable moment. But the coming together of iron tools, tidier brick hearths, and the new habits of the colonial city living all came together to create toast. It seems that toast and toasted muffins were also coming about at around the same time in London, especially as brick city construction became more common there. Brick tenements and smaller hearths and fireplaces there also meant the workers in the emerging factories were cooking small meals for themselves instead of depending so heavily on the pie sellers and taverns. In fact, tea and toast and jam will become the center of many an industrial diet in England by the 19th century because it is quick, less prone to rot, full of the quick energy of caffeine and sugar, and only a small fire is needed to make that hot cuppa and toasted muffin. Rather than the expensive fuel, lengthy shopping list, and extensive preparation required for broth or porridge or pottage or stew. Now, to clear a few things up. Were other bread-type things, flatbreads, pita, focaccia, and so on, toasted to crispness in fires? I am absolutely sure they were. And frying bread in the fat from a roast, the drippings, was a fairly common thing to do. And the double baking of enriched breads and types of cakes to make rusks, hard toasted items for soaking or gnawing on by teething babies and cranky toddlers, were certainly known. And drying stale bread and making it into crumbs that would become incorporated into farce or force meats, stuffings, and thickening for sauces was a very common thing to do. But this act of taking fairly fresh bread and purposefully heating it over a fire and then consuming it immediately as a snack or part of a meal required the coming together of this set of things that was happening in the British Empire in the 18th century. The cozy fireplace, the leisure time, the presence of loaves of skillfully made wheat bread, and access to the sort of knife that could slice the loaf, all being available to the class of people who would consider heating or preparing their own food, and having them be in circumstances where this quick, warmed snack would appeal. That earliest toast was literally a big city dish. I am starting to see that the foods that are the most uniquely American arise from a coming together of food and technology. There is an element of where the food came from, say, risen wheat breads from Europe, but it combines with emerging technology, is made more available or more convenient, or stores more easily or for longer, and thus changes in a way that allows it to become its American food self. Versions of toast will emerge and become their own things in other locations, but American toast will develop along its own trajectory. So here's to the toast of the past and our current obsession with toast now. Avocado and all. Next week, it's a return to sugar and molasses. They have arrived in the American kitchen. Pickled fruit is still around, but it is on its way out as the much more popular jams, conserves, and marmalades take up more space in cool rooms and cellars. I'll also look at some of the surprising early changes more sweetness made to the American diet, including a beer that can only be called good in comparison to pumpkin beer. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to get your early bird tickets for Intelligent Speech 2022 Crossings. Come listen to me talk about gumbo and all of the dangers of having opinions about soup. Check out the show description for links to Intelligent Speech. It'd be fun to see people there on June 25th. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. And the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOAFood and in the show description.